today. I'm Allison Delnor. I'm the interim director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm pleased to be able to welcome our guest today. Our center is grateful for the relationship that we have with the co-host of this event, the European Union Studies Association, or EUSA, or USA. USA has been hosted by Pitt for many years, and it's a relationship that encourages and facilitates collaboration and allows us to partner on many excellent events. USA selects a new chair every 2 years, and we have the honor of welcoming each chair for a center lecture here at Pitt. This year, the lecture is also supported by our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence grant funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. As part of our JMEUCE grant, programming this year is being organized under the theme of Recovering Europe. When it was envisioned, recovery broadly spoke to the pandemic, as you might imagine, but also the migration and economic crises of the last decade, which have reverberated through today and can be seen in democratic backsliding and the rise of Euroscepticism, culminating, of course, in Brexit, and continue to be as salient as ever with the outbreak of war in the Ukraine and a new wave of refugees seeking entry into Europe. As we thought about recovery then, we were also thinking about how Europe would recover from the rise of authoritarianism and other threats to democracy that seem to go hand in hand with these crises and reactionary responses to them. Europe has gone through some hard times of late, as we all have. So what kind of recovery can we foresee? So for this semester's JMEU Center of Excellence lecture, therefore, I'm pleased to welcome the current USA chair, Sarah Wallace Goodman, who is well placed to help us think through some of these issues. Professor Goodman is an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine. She's the author of Immigration and Membership Politics in Western Europe in 2014, and co-author of the forthcoming Pandemic Politics with Princeton University Press. She's also published numerous articles in Journal of Politics, World Politics, Comparative Political Studies, and the list goes on. Her work, which examines democratic citizenship and the shaping of political identity through immigrant integration, has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Hellman Fellows Fund. Today's talk draws from her latest book, Citizenship in Hard Times: How Ordinary People Respond to Democratic Threat, released by Cambridge University Press this year. So welcome, Dr. Goodman. We're so excited to have you. Before I turn it over to you, I just want to tell the audience who's joining us to please consider putting questions as they come to you as Dr. Goodman's speaking. Please put them in the Q&A and we'll be able to address them. We'll have time at the end to get to them. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to our guest, Dr. Goodman.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Allison, for that really warm introduction and for identifying kind of precisely some of what the stakes are today that I talk about in my book and what we think about when we think about mass politics and contemporary Europe. Recovery means a lot of things. We're sticking the word recovery on a lot of conferences and special issues, and it's hard to kind of think about it as we're still in the midst of it, but I'm sorry, can you just enable screen sharing for me so I can put up my slides? Thank you. So, as we think about kind of the path toward recovery as we're kind of still in it, the news of the day is certainly on my mind as I think about hard times for democracy, which is the focus of my most recent book. So I want to speak just for a moment or so how I got on this topic, right? Because as you mentioned, I studied primarily immigrant integration and how immigrants became citizens. And as I was doing work on my previous book and interviewing immigrants and policymakers, policymakers had a really clear idea in their mind of what it means to be a good citizen and that immigrants meet these standards. And in the back of my mind, as I'm doing all these interviews, I'm thinking, well, like policymakers have a really clear idea what a good citizen means. I wonder how much kind of the ordinary person holds these views or commits to these expectations and practices, because we certainly set the bar high for immigrants. So, in thinking about that and starting the drafting of kind of my next big project, kind of these big, national, global events were taking place that really threatened advanced democracies. So I want to spend kind of the first minute or so talking about what I mean about hard times. What does that mean? Political scientists use the term hard times in a lot of different contexts. We can think about economic crises. We can think about pandemics. These are all hard times. But I'm looking kind of specifically at democratic threat. What is it that weakens the institutions that uphold our democracies? And even that is kind of a really large topic. So, how could we not talk about Ukraine as we're sitting here discussing Europe and threats to democracy? So, here's a photo of just like ordinary citizens, right? And we're reading these stories about how there's now mass conscription and people trying to flee or are then trying to are being pulled into military service, or people volunteering for military service, right? It's very clear at this moment that a good citizen in Ukraine, right, who is of eligible age, right, fights for the country. So it's that's a clear understanding of what civic obligation looks like in this democratic hard time. But these are not the hard times that I studied in the book, right? Sort of clear external threat and invasion, that's a kind of a unique type of democratic threat. What I look at the book are kind of the institutional erosions, the rot, as I call it, the backsliding, the slippage of norms, the undermining of democratic practices from within. So, take the US, right? In 2016, we have this outsider candidate with kind of these weak commitments to liberal democratic norms, an uncomfortable admiration for an authoritarian strongman, this sort of toxic mix of racial politics and xenophobia, and little deference to the US Constitution, right? So these kinds of sources of internal erosion, of institutional rot. So foreign interference in election, right? The practices that enable or the lack of checks on those sorts of practices. This certainly came to a head on January 6th when we think about the internal erosion of liberal democratic values, right? So, storming the Capitol to disrupt the certification of the Electoral College vote. But of course, we could see it in a number of other practices. So it's not just kind of these big headline events, but sort of the slow incremental erosion. We might also think about it as a democratic threat. So these acts that preserve counter-majoritarian institutions, gerrymandering, decades of voter suppression, right, which persists as type of second-class citizenship for American ethnic and racial minorities. And I know you're listening and going, wait, I thought this was an European politics lecture. The point being that it's not just happening in the United States, right? This is just a reference point from writing in the United States. But if you're here listening and you want to, you study Europe or you're in Europe, right? We see that this is kind of cross-national phenomena taking place. We think about how democratic actors use tools to undermine democracy. So democratic hard times aren't unique to the United States. So we can think about Europe being far more familiar with anti-democratic practices and illiberal politics. Of course, this familiarity with it doesn't make it, unremarkable, right? It's not inured the continent to illiberalism or democratic instability. So, we can look across the continent at kind of these exclusionary national populist parties, Austria, Denmark, Switzerland, Netherlands, France, right? The list could go on. These parties that exhibit traditional authoritarian attributes and have issue positions that align themselves with kind of this large-scale populist transformation. Okay, so, right, we see xenophobic protests, we see the embracing of liberal values. This is cross-continental, transatlantic. Right, in the UK, we have this narrow defeat of the EU, which is in of itself a liberal international organization. So we see the rejection of the very kind of principles of the liberal order in that sense. A political and economic organization whose sole purpose is peace, stability, democratic commitments. Of course, looking at within the EU itself. Okay, so the point is made, right? That global transformations are taking place as part of this large-scale democratic recession or backsliding. You have this kind of rise of authoritarianism and toleration of authoritarianism in places like Poland and Hungary. Okay, So I think that the point is made. It is in this context that I started thinking about what citizens do in hard times, right? So what do citizens do when the institutions around them undergo change? Or what do citizens think their obligation is? Now, this is really a kind of context-dependent question. If I asked you, right, what does a good citizen do in response to COVID, your answer is going to be really different than what does a good citizen do in response to Russian invasion in my country, right? So the context is really important. And so I wanted to think about this specific democratic erosion and what do good citizens do in those, in those contexts. So we're talking about these events that inflict damage or undermine the institutions themselves, right? Things like elections, things like liberal norms, and that cause kind of erosion, backsliding, recession. These are kind of the manifest signals that democratic institutions are under threat. But most accounts of what we have are elite-centric. We know a lot about why these recessions or why this backsliding takes place or why they don't, because of what elites do, right? So Levitsky and Ziblatt talk about the institutional guardrails. Nancy Bermeo, right, talks about how elites eliminate institutions. Right, but we need to understand kind of the context of mass politics, right? Citizens are not just passive receivers of elite cues. Put another way, mass politics is not like merely the field where elite politics plays out, right? So citizens do more than just vote for autocrats, right? Citizens may enable an erosion of norms, or citizens may endorse certain positions that can offset erosion. So this is important because democracy, by definition, draws sovereignty from its citizens. So through participation, through liberal value commitments, right, citizens distinguish advanced democracies from weakly institutionalized forms. So we want to know about citizens' commitments to institutions, not just their participation in them. So by thinking about kind of what citizens are doing and where they see their role in legitimating democratic institutions, I kind of turn the lens around. So we know a lot about what elites are doing, and I really want to know kind of how citizens are feeling during these hard times. And that's the question kind of that the book asks, right? What makes a good citizen in hard times? I want to know what makes a good citizen in hard times, both within one country. I want to know whether we can generalize about democratic citizenship across, in cross-case comparisons, if we can see something significant about democratic citizenship more generally. I want to know what aspects of citizenship are affected by democratic threat. And I want to specifically know whether a citizen's commitments or civic obligations are conditioned or threatened by partisan identity. So I take kind of a specific view in thinking about how an individual is connected to a political system, right, vis-a-vis a political party, and whether that identity competes with a civic identity. So it's kind of an interesting, I want to use the word interesting because I find it interesting. I've come to discover over the process of writing this book that my friends and husband don't find it as interesting as I do. But I'm just like, I made a career about studying citizenship, and I like the idea that we can view, or I don't like it, but I find it interesting that we can view these identities as in tension with one another, right? So civic identity, your citizenship, your commitment, and your sort of transactional relationship to the state is an identity that's meant to supersede partisanship, right? These are the values of the state. These are the values of your regime type that you uphold and that you have a participatory exchange with the state in having, which is different from your partisan identity. But we've spent now, political scientists have spent 2 odd decades or so kind of thinking critically about the rise of partisan identity as a social identity. And citizenship is also a type of social identity. So we're thinking about these alongside one another. So does partisanship influence how you think of your civic duty? Is essentially kind of what I'm asking specifically when we think about democratic threat. And that really matters because so many of these threats are conditioned by partisanship directly, right? Whether you think something is threatening or not can be a function of the elite cues that your party leader sends you. So I think about partisanship in this book, not necessarily as, the party you vote for or even the programmatic agenda of that party, but it's the team that you play on, and whether you see sort of responding to a threat or not, or whether you acknowledge something as threatening or not, as either benefiting or threatening your team. So that's kind of what connects us to political outcomes, and that connects us to whether we, the role we see for ourselves in democratic hard times. So to preview the argument that I make in the book, I show that threat affects citizenship norms, right? So when democratic threat takes place, citizens change what they think it means to be a good citizen, right? So they find obligation in responding to threat. This kind of response, this uneven response, right? That some citizens respond and some citizens respond and some citizens don't. That can sever, right, kind of the necessary consensus we need for national unity. That's a theoretical argument that I make in the book that I'm not really going to talk about today, but just the idea that there needs to be a consensus of liberal democratic commitments that exist between citizens to kind of make the whole thing work. It's a foundation that kind of enables the democratic project to take place, right? Democracies need Democrats, lowercase d. So we know that threat affects civic obligation. We know that, and what I show is that the type of threat matters, right? So not all citizens respond to all threats. Not all things are considered threatening. And then the second major argument that I show is that people respond based on partisanship. So whether you think something is threatening or not is conditioned by your partisanship, and how you respond is also conditioned by your partisanship. So you interpret your civic obligation through your partisan identity. So partisanship identifies whether what your interests are in responding. And then I also make an argument in comparing the UK, Germany with the US. I make an argument that the type of democratic institutions you have provide a meaningful context for how you understand whether something is in your interest or not, right? That we see important differences between the US and the UK, which has a more zero-sum political system, versus Germany, which has a more consensus or positive-sum political system. So what I want to do today is kind of walk through some of the descriptive findings that I have about what good citizenship looks like, what the norms are of good citizenship. I think it's really interesting from a cross-national perspective to look at these three democracies and see, what does it mean to be a good citizen in the UK? Is it similar or different than Germany? And where do we see similarities and differences? So this is a kind of descriptive snapshot of mass politics when it comes to civic obligation. So to briefly kind of outline what the book does in total, I examined citizenship norms, right, in three kind of typical cases. So, I chose the US, the UK, and Germany because Ullman and Verba look at those three cases, and that's kind of the foundational text when we think about civic culture, when we think about what citizens do, both from a behavioral perspective and in terms of thinking about types of democracies or democratic variation among advanced democracies. So as I mentioned, right, there's a theoretical argument that I make about consensus for national unity, and that appears in chapter 2. So what I'm going to show today is findings from chapters 3 and 4, how I measure citizenship norms, what patterns of similarities and differences look like both over time and cross-nationally, and then whether there's kind of a latent partisan structure to these findings. To these norms. If time permits, I'll show kind of one of the survey experiments that I conducted in the book, kind of how specifically citizens respond to specific types of democratic threat. But if not, I can just kind of flag it and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you have questions. So the book makes use of 3 nationally representative surveys conducted over the summer of 2019. The book also offers a new conceptualization of democratic citizenship norms. And as I mentioned, kind of a theory of democratic instability based on liberal democratic consensus among citizens. Okay. So what are citizenship norms? Why do they matter? This is kind of the first question that I want to tackle. So we kind of understand what it is we're talking about when we think about kind of mass politics here. We think about what ordinary citizens mean and what they may possibly do in hard times. So by norms, I'm talking about these shared expectations about the citizen's role in politics, what we think we're supposed to do, right? Or what we think a good citizen does. These are the rules or expectations really that regulate our attitudes and our behavior. So they precede attitudes and behavior. If you think that being an active citizen is important, you're more likely to then go and be an active citizen. And a lot of what we know about citizens in hard times looks at the behavior stuff, like looks at the participation itself, but we really need to understand the values that precede that. Because, you know, if we look back at hard times, or we look, illiberal marches happen as well. We also have illiberal protesting. So we can't just look at behavior itself to attach a meaning to it with respect to citizen behavior. We need to understand the motive behind that behavior, which requires us looking at the preceding norms. There's a long literature in political science that thinks about norms and describes kind of the different democratic citizenship norms that people might hold. These are mostly dispositional, right? Whether people are active or passive, whether you're allegiant, you're assertive, you're critical, you're engaged, you're dutiful, right? This is kind of how we understand or have understood norms so far. I kind of make an argument in the book, though, that these aren't particularly descriptive, right? They don't tell us, for example, when citizens might view restraint as a meaningful behavior because it's not operationalized, right, in these kind of dispositional approaches. Or, right, we don't know how to kind of distinguish between this sort of norm set and behavior set when we kind of look at these behaviors directly, or these dispositions directly, I should say. So what I do is I think through kind of a more descriptive way of thinking about citizenship norms and these different ways that citizens might think about their role mattering, yeah. Because democratic norms play an important part in telling the story of democratic legitimacy, right? So norms place individuals within the democratic picture. They place them not just in a legitimacy perspective, but they place them as a part of the democratic process, not just in terms of what they do in terms of voting, but when we hear political leaders talk about the values of a country, right, or we hear them talk about national goals, right? These goals are held and articulated by ordinary citizens, and they are maintained through norms. Others have argued that norms tell us about the health of representative democracy. So, you can't have a democracy without the lowercase democrats. We need to then know how much democratic and liberal values are held within that group. And as I mentioned, they precede and shape behavior as well as attitudes. So there are studies that show that norms can lead to support for redistribution or not, right? Which can, of course, also then lead to exclusionary practices. So norms are kind of an important part of the story. And so far, what we know, in addition to kind of these dispositional understandings of norms, we know that what causes norms generally is generational change or socioeconomic change. But what I want to focus on and think critically about is the role of regime shocks. So what happens when the rules around you, when the context in which you hold these norms start to change, right? Do you view your role as kind of perpetuating vague standards? Do you view your role as responding to this kind of shift? So it's a kind of dynamic way to think about norms. So what I do is I offer new conceptualization in the text. I think about kind of these three dimensions or buckets of citizenship values. So a citizen can hold certain norms about behavior, right? That a good citizen participates or, or not, right? That you can have variation on this idea, so that we have norms of behavior. And this is largely what the citizenship literature shows us already when we talk about participatory citizenship or engaged citizenship or dutiful citizenship. These are sort of the dimensions that that we already know about these behaviors, about how people think they should act. But I think it's really important to understand that in hard times, when we kind of have politicized and institutionalized practices of populism and xenophobia, that we can't take for granted how much ordinary citizens hold liberal democratic values or not, right? We need sort of to understand how much obligation they find in maintaining values that move beyond behavior, that go beyond, say, joining associations. We need to understand how much ordinary citizens view commitments to liberal democratic values as part of their obligation, as maintaining these values. So citizens can be, at the same time participatory and liberal. They can be at the same time nationalistic and participatory. So we need to understand kind of how they mix together as well. So what I do is I add a lot of new dimensions in thinking about civic obligation, so that, a good citizen is not just someone who behaves a certain way or has certain dispositions towards their government, but a good citizen holds a certain set of beliefs. And a good citizen may also gatekeep or monitor national belonging. So it's on this third dimension that, from an immigration perspective, I find most kind of interesting, the idea that a good citizen may also think that their role is some sort of national gatekeeper, and that in their minds, a good citizen, or it is a civic obligation to speak English, right? If you live in the US or the UK, or a good citizen is patriotic, so holds a certain set of values that are outside of liberal democratic norms. So it is possible that these exist as well, and just sort of previous treatments haven't really thought about this dimension of good citizenship, because the problem of democratic, I should say, the problem of democracy was participation, right? It wasn't about value commitments. It wasn't about the rise in populism. So we kind of have, as times change, we have to acknowledge that the values that citizens hold may change as well. So the book forwards these kind of three buckets or ways of thinking about norms of good citizenship, that good citizens behave in certain ways, that good citizens hold certain beliefs, that good citizens may acknowledge certain attributes of national belonging. I'm not going to show you all the items. What I do in the book is I have 14 different possible items or dimensions of good citizenship, but I want to go through and highlight some of the patterns, maybe some of the ways in which the data can be used to show you similarities and variation across systems. So, on the left here, this is a traditional question about, a good citizen always votes, right? How much you agree or disagree with that statement? And we see that across, so the top one, I know it's Zoom, right? So we're all like on our phones or something like that, right? So we see that there's convergence across the US, the UK, and Germany. These are three, each line represents a different country, and these are three different years in which this question was asked. So 2004, 2014, these were on the International Social Survey Program, the ISSP, and then I just replicated it in 2019. So we see that there is real convergence over time, that sort of as these big shifts are taking place in democracies, voting becomes a more important attribute in Germany, which then converges with sort of already higher valuations in the UK and the US. If we look at keeps watch on government. So this is kind of an interesting question. So a good citizen keeps watch on government. That's like a traditional liberal value, right? That we are ever vigilant and kind of inherently distrustful of government. We see that there's a marked variation in terms both over time and cross-nationally, but overall we're talking about 4 out of 5, right? Overall, these have a very high valuation that a good citizen watches government, but good citizens are vigilant. So here we have a sense, and these are both behaviors. These are kind of things that citizens should do. I add a bunch of original items, as I mentioned, the beliefs, the liberal democratic beliefs, and the items of national belonging. Here are some of the beliefs that I added in 2019. So I don't have over time, but this gives you a descriptive snapshot about what countries, how countries compare. So, right, so in response to the question, like, how much do you agree that a good citizen has friends of different political opinions? So overall, pretty high valuation, higher in the US and the UK than Germany, but high overall, around between 3.5 and 4 out of 5. Accepts diversity, so high overall. A good citizen in hard times a good citizen accepts diversity. A good citizen is patient, recognizing that sometimes their side wins and sometimes their side loses. A kind of forbearance question, but for citizens. So we see high valuations for all these items, right? Because these are really costless, right? It doesn't require kind of a real reckoning with one's personal ego to sort of say, yeah, good citizens do these things, right? So like as a test for that, I included this item that like a good citizen supports government, right? So we can think how that would not be a way to illustrate, good citizen, if you also agree that a good citizen challenges government or a good citizen watches government. And that's what we see, right? People evaluate this much lower, which kind of shows some internal coherence to these items. But I think it's important to ask because, we can infer all sorts of kind of illiberal or autocratic, warm to autocratic preferences in looking at citizens' behaviors. But again, it's these norms that precede behaviors, which are really meaningful for understanding citizen mass culture. So we have kind of some of these new items in thinking about beliefs, right? The liberal democratic beliefs that you may or may not hold. And then, as I mentioned, we have also items about belonging. So do you think it's important that a good citizen speaks German, right? Speaks English, right? So this dot here is the US. So in the European cases, we see that speaking in the national language is a really important dimension of being a good citizen, far less so in the US. We see the opposite pattern though when we talk about patriotism. So being a good citizen in the US, it's very important to feel American, far less so in Germany, which is all the way on the left here. So we have some variation when it comes to that third dimension of good citizenship, national belonging. This just obeys the law. I'll go over that. So, we have these, like I said, there's 14 different dimensions. And one of the things that I do in the book is, I run a factor analysis to see kind of how these interrelate and group together. And here we see another interesting finding. So it allows us to see which of these items relate to other items. And this tells us that this confirms the 3 dimensions of citizenship. But importantly, right, we see that in the US and in the UK, all 4 of the items of national belonging stick tightly together. So kind of like an allegiant citizen who thinks it's a good citizen, obeys the law, supports government, feels British, speaks English. We don't see that strong correlation in Germany, right? We see that these items do not load with these items. And so what that tells us is that these are more government dispositional items, and rule obeyance do not relate to sort of nationalistic values in a way that they do in the US and the UK. That's an important takeaway, I think, in thinking about how citizens group their identities. But like I said, what I want to think about is how much of these beliefs are related to your partisanship. So how much does partisanship moderate or drive attitudes, norms, commitments. So what I show here is basically those 3 buckets, right? The behavior, beliefs, and belonging. How much difference do we see in civic norms by partisanship? Right. So what this shows us, on the top row here is that Democrats are more behavioral than Republicans. Okay, maybe that comports to priors that you hold, right? That Democrats think in aggregate, right, that some of those behavioral items of good citizenship are more important. Moving to belief, and this we kind of know from the literature already. Moving to beliefs, we see that the Democrats think liberal democratic commitments are more important than Republicans on whole. And then we see for items of national belonging that Republicans think these are more important attributes of good citizenship than Democrats. But like these are aggregate items. And so one of the benefits, I think, of the data in the book, and one of the things that you can do with it is really look at these findings and see, well, what's driving it? So this is an aggregate. If we looked more closely at behavior, we see that it's really protesting that drives this difference, that Democrats think protesting is more important than Republicans. Okay. But that's not to say then that there are these kind of larger divergences in norm commitments between Republicans and Democrats, right? So the item itself is meaningful. When we look at beliefs, so what are the liberal democratic beliefs that drives this difference? It's tolerance and it's forbearance. So Democrats are more likely to value helping people, so a solidarity, right? And Democrats are more likely to accept diversity. And that might be concerning, but I think it's mollifying to think that other items like valuing other people, understanding other people's opinions, having friends of different opinions, those we see no divergence between partisanship. So we have that minimum consensus of liberal democratic values. That's really important. And it's like rarely, I think, in the line of work I do you have a finding you're like, I feel better having looked at that, but that's one of them. And then on belonging, we see kind of there are statistically significant differences on all of those items between Democrats and Republicans. When we look at the UK, we see similar patterns, but deeper. I guess you can say they're kind of just stronger. So when we look at behavior, again, similar when we think about it's similarly driven by protesting, but like Labor and Lib Dems are more likely to value things like joining associations, vigilance, so keeping watch on government. These are deeper partisan differences than we saw in the US when it comes to items of behavior. Moving to kind of the middle category, the liberal democratic beliefs. Here we see the same pattern that we saw in the US. And this is kind of a nice comparison because it shows us kind of within kind of these first past the post systems, kind of how sides can be kind of really drawn in any area. So we see kind of this liberal democratic core of mutual tolerance, right, remain intact alongside some of these other differences. So that liberal democratic core that I talk about is, somewhat reassuring in the US. We also see in the UK. But what we also see here is that predictably on items of belonging, conservatives value speaking English, patriotism, obeying the law, and supporting government because they're in government versus supporters of the Labour Party. When we move to Germany, we see more consensus, right? We see less difference across partisan groups. And this, as I mentioned in the book, I argue is a function of kind of consensus politics. We find partisan consensus on liberal democratic dimensions where there's no statistical differences between political parties. Obviously, the AfD being in a liberal party does not hold liberal values or does not value liberal values as a role of good citizenship. And then we see some really important differences when it comes to belonging. But again, recall that the aggregate measure for this is you don't want to lean too heavily on that or push too hard on that data. So let me just kind of like focus on the takeaway here because I see we're kind of running out of time here. So one of the takeaways is that we see in polarized systems, The left is generally more behavioral. This comports to kind of previous literature and our expectations. The right is generally more allegiant, nationalistic. Belonging items exhibit kind of the strongest differences. But again, we have cross-national similarities. There is support for democratic citizenship values across systems, that kind of minimum consensus that we need in hard times. And actually in all times, right? Because it confers democratic legitimacy. We have more overlaps than we have differences. And like, if you're curious, I have all these, the 14 items by partisanship in the extra slides that I'm happy to go over. But it shows that there is some important overlap. And this overlap is really critical, not just because it confers national unity and democratic legitimacy, but it enables citizens to kind of respond potentially to crises. Right? And so then in the rest of the book, what I do is I kind of stress test these values. I have two types of democratic crises that I test in the book: political polarization and foreign interference in election. So essentially what I do is I present, survey respondents with information about polarization in that case, and say it is a democratic threat. Here are some reasons why. I ask them if they agree with that or not. So I have a series of open-ended questions, which have provided some very colorful language in response to some of these prompts. And then I ask them to evaluate good citizenship afterwards. What are the attributes of good citizens? And in response to these kinds of questions, right, we see that status quo challengers are more responsive to democratic threat. They essentially have more to gain by responding to threat than status quo beneficiaries. This aligns with partisanship. And that stakes for responding, positional stakes, are defined by the institutional system that you're in. So costs are kind of lower and more diffuse in positive sum systems like Germany, where you have more iterations, so more at-bats. Apologize for the sports metaphor. I don't know why I would do that. And then you have, so those responses exhibit more consensus. We see less partisan differences in Germany versus the US and the UK when we look specifically at response to threat. And so I think I will kind of, so I'm happy to answer questions on polarization threat, on foreign interference. I also had a paper on immigration threat. I have data on COVID threat. So I'm happy to talk about threats, citizen responses, the book itself. I think I'll finish up there. Briefly then, let me just show kind of the takeaway. That's not the takeaway slide. Where's the takeaway slide? Sorry. There, okay. The so what, I just want to end on here. So what I know from looking at all these threats across all these countries is that threat is political, right? It's what you make of it. So whether you see something as threatening can be a function of your partisanship, whether you have something to gain or not in responding to threat is strongly determined by your partisan identity. We see that not all citizens respond, and this could be worrying, particularly in the context of democratic threat when it affects the context around us. And we know that kind of citizen apathy can be seen as a kind of quiet, silent consensus for authoritarian power grabs. And then the last is that we see this pervasive response determined by your side, by your team, which really undermines citizenship as a whole. If citizens respond to incentives as partisans and not as citizens, then kind of the idea that citizenship is this identity that supersedes our differences and allows our differences because it creates these minimum standards of consensus, that really becomes, the institution itself becomes under threat as democratic times change around us. So I will end there then. Thank you. On a sad note.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to ask people to please feel free to ask their questions. And you can either put them in the chat, you can put them in the Q&A, or if you'd like to ask them directly, we can enable you to speak. So feel free to raise your hand using the little raise hand function at the bottom of the screen. We do have a first question that came in. So while I would normally take take the first question, I'm going to go ahead and just start throwing it over to the audience. So Kate McNamara asks two questions. Can you address the issue of how elite cues interact with the citizen partisan democratic beliefs? I love the emphasis on the everyday and what people actually believe, but curious where they get those beliefs and to further complexify the role of practices in shaping those beliefs. And then there's a two, which you can see, but can you speak to what your findings mean for policy and our efforts to shore up democracy, which was basically going to be my question. So.
Right. Well, they're both hard. So thanks. Hi, Kate. Thanks for those questions. Yeah, they're questions I think about all the time. And so I know that my answers won't be satisfying. So, ultimately and inevitably, I started this talk with, we don't know what citizens are doing and the literature relies too much on elites. And it's still true even after I do this, and even after I write an entire book about citizens, because elites are the source of cues, like for better or worse, right? And like I hate the idea that so much of how citizens understand what is threatening is a function of how elites present the threat to them. That in the early days I did a pilot of the survey experiment, and in one of them, I said, polarization is a threat, blah, blah, and I gave them all the information. And it didn't work. It didn't work without the elite framing. So what I did with, then I had these two pilots was, one paragraph with the control was like, this is why polarization is threatening. And then it was the exact same, but with a second paragraph saying like, elites are talking about this and this random made up policy institute tells us that it's a threat. And so like it provides not just like a rubber stamp, but it's like a real effective message, way to convey messages, right? And that's where people get their cues. And so, so while, citizens listening to elites is an important part of the puzzle, like we have a system, because of the constrained media, we have a system in which citizens have to rely on elites, which means we have to rely on elites to do the right thing. That is so frustrating. And that just kind of takes us back around again to where we started. Like if an elite doesn't see it in their interest as presenting something as a threat, if Republican leaders can refer to January 6th as, what was it, legitimate political discourse, like there's no like wedge to get in between that elite citizen like queuing stream. There's, which is incredibly frustrating. So inevitably we come back around to elites. I know it's such a depressing answer to your question. I'm so sorry. But that's not to say that happens in all cases, in all contexts, right? We see different kind of elite messaging from within the Republican Party. The majority of Republicans agree with Liz Cheney, right? Not the majority of Republican leadership. So I think it is important to pay attention to what kind of ordinary citizens think on average and on the whole, as opposed to just elites, but still respecting that like this kind of communication channel like is really meaningful and influential for citizens. Okay, I think that maybe that addresses question one. Findings about policy and our efforts to shore up democracy. Okay, so this is something I tackle in the conclusion, and I think about civic education a lot. I think about civic education all the time, but like specifically within the context of this book, like how, because there is now a discourse about, well, how do we educate citizens for hard times? How do we prepare them, like as, I don't want to use the metaphor of soldiers, but how do we prepare them for thinking about their role in democracy when democracy is under threat? And the problem is like, there's no way of educating around motivated reasoning, but there are ways to educate people to consume information more critically. There are ways thinking about implementable policy solutions at the education, at K through 12 education, and thinking about media literacy, debate skills. I mean, these are some of the ideas that I think about. It's about building a critical citizenry that can kind of consume information that is not so elite dependent. But again, like it's still early days, and there's still like a lot of work just kind of starting now about how you bridge partisan gaps. And I think that this kind of thinking about civic education is related to that, right? Is overcoming sort of the team or the sidism tendencies that we have, and thinking about not just preserving cross-cutting values, but cross-cutting networks, right? Rebuilding some of those in highly polarized contexts.
Yeah, I think civic education is a really interesting question and goes a long way to explaining why so many arguments today center around what's happening in schools, and thinking about how we're educating kids. I'll wait and see if other questions come out of the chat, or if people want to raise their hands to ask. I see lots of familiar names in here, so I wouldn't be surprised if we get some other questions here. But I was thinking about some of the things that you mentioned about differences across the UK, the US, and Germany. And as a historian, I start to go away from some of the data that you're presenting and thinking about the differences that exist in your talk. And as you started talking about sort of differences in the institutions, I was wondering how much has to do with differences in and I guess this sort of goes a little bit back to civic education, but in those national histories and in the stories we tell about our national histories and what's important in those stories, what gets picked out to present. So I'm wondering how much of that is, underpins some of the differences.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you think about, the US and its uniquely associational life, right? So we see that as like associational life is more highly valued, thinking back to Tocqueville, right? In the US, and we see in Germany and in the UK. In Germany, in the post-68 generation, we see higher valuations of protesting across the partisan spectrum versus, in the US and UK, where we really see it reserved to kind of individuals that identify on the left. I would say that historically, and obviously the nationalism item, when it's important to feel British, German, versus American. I mean, the US is in a uniquely historical case that has allowed nationalism to somehow preserve, or I should say patriotism to perpetuate over time untainted by its historical role. Because this is Pennsylvania. Yeah, so I can say because we ban critical race theory. So sorry, some talks, then I suppose this would be blacked out. But in any event, so there's obviously historical precedences, but the liberal democratic values, these are liberal democracies. So it's really important that we see these cross-national patterns across citizens, which we do. I would say that there's one finding that I found particularly notable, which kept showing up regardless of the type of threat. And it's that in the UK, in response to kind of any threat, you see this kind of hunkering down. The move away from accepting diversity, it's pretty cross, labor and conservatives, right? And the importance of feeling British. So that was any type of threat. We saw this hunkering down, which was illuminating. I looked by partisanship, I looked by Brexit status, so whether you voted leave versus remain, and this was kind of a continual, this finding preserved across threats, and I'm tossing around what to make of that. That it's the island mentality, the problems stop at the water's edge. I don't know, but that you can sort of see this as see this in response to any type of threat. It's something I wrestle with in the book, and something that now I just always think about, sort of this tendency, this exhibited tendency to become to highlight the more nationalistic elements of Britishness without saying, white or Christian or, whatever those values mean, because I didn't ask those items. But that's sort of the what's the word? The revealing, I guess, of these sort of latent nationalistic tendencies was very significant to me.
Yeah, I've got all sorts of thoughts running through my head right now. We could have a lot of conversation about that. But I do want to turn to another question about that comes from our from my colleague JJ Spoon, who has a very close role in this center. So JJ says, which comes first, democracy under threat or the rise and success of populist parties? Are they creating the democracy under threat and or using this to attract more supporters? Which comes first, or are they iterative?
I mean, they're certainly iterative, but I think we pretend that the party comes before the threat because they get in on democratic channels, right? So I actually think that that's a very serious mistake that we make. So you take, the AfD, right, who use electoral channels to get, to get seats in parliament, and that by doing so then conveys a kind of veneer of, or, paints a veneer of legitimacy on this process. But that's, but then they're already kind of institutionalized and legitimated in a way that then when we start to see anti-immigrant rhetoric or things that are clearly illiberal in values or practices, then they're already speaking from a position of legitimized authority by being within the democratic system. So they are iterative, but I think the mistake that we make sort of politically is to somehow divorce the democratic channels by which they gain power and the narrative or programmatic agenda that they use or pursue once they're in power.
We have another question from Nils Ringa in Wisconsin. I'm starting to feel a little bit like a talk show host calling in from Wisconsin. I'm wondering how you think Germany's consensus politics are going to handle some of the major changes in Germany's foreign and especially security policy that Chancellor Scholz has recently announced. Those changes deviate quite dramatically from Germany's self-image as a defensive soft power. Is Germany's public opinion going to accept this, given external threat that is not so very tangible, or do you think there will be significant contestation?
I think that it will look a lot like the 2015 refugee crisis, in that there will be early rallying, right? Everyone, with the "we can do it" spirit, and then you'll see a swift and precipitous drop off once the threat becomes more routinized, i.e. the war becomes longer, or once parties see political advantage in eroding the current consensus, right? I mean, it was the sister party from Bavaria that first started to chip away at Angela Merkel's consensus on refugees, right? So it was kind of within house and to their political advantage to kind of challenge some of the welcoming policies. So I kind of think a similar pattern will take place.
Great. Thank you so much for this. I'm actually going to cut off questions, unfortunately, because we're getting to that point where people need to start going to their next things, and I don't want to lose people while we're still having such an interesting conversation. I'm sure we could talk about this for a very long time, as it is an issue, I think, that is on all of our minds most of the time. But thank you very much for your insights, for your work. I actually look forward to finishing the book. Didn't get a chance to do that yet, but I am looking forward to that. So I want to thank you for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't do it in person as we had originally intended, but it was nice to be able to therefore share it with a larger platform. And thanks to Yusa for co-sponsoring, and to Dr. Spoon for helping to organize it in the beginning. And I also want to thank our partners in the Jean Monnet and the USA Network for helping to get the word out and promote it. So thank you so much for your time, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.